Okay. Welcome everyone. Welcome people at home behind the screen. We're live from Het Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam. We're in a blended setting. There's people in the audience. Usually we can have 180 people, but due to COVID it's restricted to 26. Still, I'm very happy you're here. It's very special also to have real people here in the room. And I hope that you in the audience back home also have a perfect connection and will follow the events, I don't know, from your couch or from your desk, or maybe I don't know where you are. From the taxi, maybe Paul and Irene, who we're also expecting, are now listening to us. I'm Dirk van de Heuvel. I'm the moderator of today. I feel like a TV host because of the planned session and because of COVID, etc. You know, Peter Weibel has mentioned that the only thing that cultural institutions can do is to become much better than Netflix. I'm not sure if that's possible, but let's try. So yeah, TV host, I'm a moderator. Where are we now? Het Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam is an institute for architecture, design and e-culture, digital culture. We do a lot of things. We have a vast collection of architecture and urbanism. We are the center or one of the nodes in a network of digital archives, archives for design. We think of ourselves as a think tank, sometimes as a para-institute, sometimes as a probe. We organize all sorts of speculative projects, and what we have a museum, of course, but I think the new direction, and we had a. I'm saying this because we had all sorts of discussions online also with the international network of architecture museums, which is these 3 days also hosted online by Het Nieuwe Instituut, and we were discussing what is the forefront of architecture institutions and research institutions and who have these collections. And Guus Beumer, the former director of this institute, really embraced the new instability of both societal questions, of how to be diverse and inclusive, how to be multivocal, and leave behind the securities of the historical canon, the classic historiographies, and indeed embrace those new questions that are around us, and also embrace the new tools, so to speak, and among those very prominently the digital, of course. Now this is where the New Institute likes to situate itself, at the forefront, and preferably a little bit before the forefront. What are the new questions? Can we already look beyond that horizon? We have quite a diverse research program for that. It's not a classic academic research program that's been developed over the last years. But in addition to those classic functionalities of the exhibition, the publication, research has become one of the core elements of this institute. There's a research department that's headed by Marina Otero, looking in all sorts of questions related to design, architecture and digital culture. And those new questions from society, the more than human knowledge, biodiversity, etc. There's a special new project with Rosie Braidotti, which is called the New Academy, trying to localize, identify where new knowledge is being developed, not in the classic institutions, but really actually in the city. And there's the Jan Bakema Study Center. This is where I am. It's a special collaboration with TU Delft, open to collaborations with third partners. And basically what we do is we bring research to the collection here at the Institute. with these fundamental societal questions, urgent societal questions in the back of our mind. And we succeeded in embedding the Institute and the collection in 3 networks of PhD research, which is a wholly new development, at least for here in Rotterdam. One PhD program is called Architecture and Democracy, which is really between Delft and the New Institute. Small but very important. The second network is a national program developed with other heritage spaces and with other universities, Maastricht University and Rijnwaard Academy and Rotterdam University Erasmus. This is in the framework of the Smart Culture program of the Dutch National Scientific Organization. And it looks into policies of diversity and inclusion in heritage spaces. And the third network, that's what's happening here now, and it's happening these 2 weeks when we do the summer school. That's the TACK network, and we're super happy that the New Institute is part of this. It's 10 PhDs in 10 universities with architecture firms connected and with 3 cultural institutions working together on one program that is focusing on tacit knowledge in architecture. We have been discussing this the days before. We will be discussing it in the coming week. It's very exciting, I think, with reenactments, archive dives, video diaries, etc. And the person who organized most of the program here will tell more about this. Hamish Lonergan, who I will give the word now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. And I'd like to thank Dirk and the Het Nieuwe Instituut for hosting us here with the TACK Summer School, which is called Reenacting Tacit Knowledge 20th Century Architecture Summer Schools. TACK, or Communities of Tacit Knowledge, Architecture and Its Ways of Knowing, aims to better understand the tacit knowledge of architecture, the embodied, social, and often unconscious ways of knowing that architects draw on when designing buildings and cities. TACK is an innovative training network as part of the Marie Curie actions within the European Horizons 2020 framework. As Dirk mentioned, it's composed of 10 European universities, 9 architectural firms, and 3 leading cultural institutes for architecture, including the New Institute. These partners jointly offer an innovative PhD training program in the field of tacit knowledge in architecture, resulting in 10 parallel PhD projects. So this summer school is a really exciting opportunity because it involves the 10 PhDs of the TACK network, but also a large number of external participants from other areas of research within the European Union and beyond. And it investigates the tacit knowledge of architectural summer schools themselves as a quite distinctive typology of architectural education that kind of emerges in the 20th century. And there are several prominent examples that we're interested in, such as the Summer Academy in Salzburg, the International Laboratory for Architecture and Urbanism, or ILAUD, and the NIA masterclasses at this institute's predecessor. And we're interested in what the archives of these summer schools can tell us, but also what they leave out. What sort of tacit knowledge can be accessed through these explicit archival documents alone, but also what sort of social embodied and unconscious knowledge does it leave out and what's missing. And how might we activate these archives through a set of experimental methods, things like performance, fictocriticism, other forms of writing, video diaries, and above all, reenactment. The fundamental hypothesis that we're pursuing is that in some way bodily reenacting these summer schools, using the same programs, similar drawing methods, discussions and seminars, and even informal meals, that we come to find something out about these summer schools that we didn't know before, that we can't find through the archives alone. So for that reason, we're particularly pleased that tonight we can welcome our guest, Albena Yaneva, whose work has been an incredibly important part of our project in the TACK network, particularly her work in OMA and the office ethnography, but also her recent book, Crafting History, Archiving and the Quest of Architectural Legacy, which examines the strange ways that archives behave, the agency and objectives of those involved, and prompts a whole lot of questions that we've found really productive in this summer school and in the network as a whole. Things like, what sort of tacit, embodied and social knowledge can we find in the archive? How can we activate that knowledge? And even what constitutes an archive in architecture? And is there a craft to archiving itself? So we're very much looking forward to discussing these kind of questions with Albena this evening, and what sort of material and social forms of knowing are specific to architectural archives. But before I welcome Albena, I'd like to introduce her to everyone here, although I'm sure many of you already are very familiar with her work. But Albena Yaneva is a professor of architectural theory at the University of Manchester. Her research is intrinsically transdisciplinary and spans the boundaries of science studies, cognitive anthropology, architectural theory, and political philosophy. She's been a visiting professor at the Princeton School of Architecture and Parsons School of Design, and in 2017 she was awarded the Lise Meitner Visiting Chair in Architecture at Lund University. After studying for a PhD in sociology and anthropology with Bruno Latour, Yaneva worked at Harvard University, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, and the Austrian Academy of Science in Vienna. She is the author of The Making of Buildings, made by the OMA, an ethnography of design, Mapping Controversies in Architecture, 5 Ways to Make Architecture Political, An Introduction to the Politics of Design Practice, The New Architectural Science, and her most recent book, which is what she'll be discussing with us this evening, Crafting History, Archiving the Quest for Architectural Legacy. So I'm really pleased that we can welcome Albena Yaneva here in person, which is a real treat for us all here this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hamish. Thank you, Dirk, for this invitation and for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here live. The title of today's lecture is Archival Ways of Knowing. And I will talk about archival knowledge, and this study on archival knowledge is motivated by a number of recent developments in philosophy and the arts, in anthropology as well, in archival science, dating all back to the 90s. So I would like just to spend a moment taking you back to the 90s before we talk about archival knowledge today. So in the 90s, we have the archival fever, the writings of Derrida, Paul Ricoeur, and all this concept of archival fever spreading from philosophy to the arts. We have the advent of archival arts, the archival fever spreading also in anthropology, and anthropology experiencing its own archival turn with the writings of Michael Sachlins, and at the same time, in the 90s, we witnessed an empirical turn in archival science, we might say. So all these developments open up new venues for exploring architectural archiving. Again, back in the 90s, that is how life in an architectural practice looked like before AutoCAD. The late 1980s and 90s is the moment when the computer entered architectural practice and radically transformed the way we design. The awareness that the paper drawing can have an archival value gained a momentum, and archives piled up in big firms, and offices and big firms began appointing archivists and record managers. So these are the very first traces of archival fever, we might say, in practice. New versions of computer-aided design, form-generating software, parametric and post-parametric applications came to replace the tradition of sketching. A multiplicity of tools for video recording and data collection has added to the already diversified repertoire of archiving. So that technological moment when digital materials moved into a dominant position made architects become more aware of the importance of organizing archives and taking care of their legacy. It is hard to imagine the act of design without thinking of the archiving gesture. The amassing of archives happens as an underlying dimension of design practice, underpinning its existence. It is inherent to the creative process, and the more architects create, the messier their offices get, and thus the greater the need for organizing and archiving the material become. Some practices keep everything, and this is a practice I studied 20 years ago, so precisely 20 years. I was in this city and I began following architects from OMA at work in their practice. And I have followed how form models also travel and become part of the knowledge generation of architects, how they become part of the archives as well, travel to storage space and come back to the practice many times. A few years later, I witnessed the same in Peter Eisenman's practice. He keeps everything, and he explains in a long discussion, he explains, I quote, "We do not do any selection. When it overwhelms us, we just put everything into storage." So architecture, end of quote, architectural practice, we see it naturally results in an extraordinary accumulation of visuals and archival media that demand sorting, cataloging, and organizing at a certain moment in time in order to avoid the amorphous accumulation of materials. But what is the difference between collection and archive? As we discuss archiving and the great collection of Peter Eisenman, he carefully traces the distinction between collection and conscious archive, claiming that all his collections, and he's a great collector of letters, books, magazines, he has the letters of Roe, drawings of Palladio, so all these collections are not consciously archival. Archiving requires an extra effort to organize, catalog, take inventory, code, preserve, and maintain a collection. While collections inspire design and design thinking, the archive is a product of it and is embedded in the design present. In recent years, we have witnessed a seismic shift, and I here quote Barry Bergdahl, when contemporary architects began getting valuations of their works. Some of them even started setting up their own foundations, following the example of Le Corbusier's foundation, which you see on this slide. We have seen, for instance, Norman Foster's foundation was founded in Madrid in 2015. Renzo Piano has the Fondazione Renzo Piano set up in 2008. Herzog and Demeron's cabinet in Basel. Zaha Hadid also began her Zaha Hadid Foundation in 2013, prior to her death. Each of these foundations holds archives and libraries of the respective architects with the aim of exhibiting and promoting the legacy of their works into posterity. So all these developments point to the need to question the role of archives in contemporary architecture. My ambition here is to shift the scholarly attention from the archive to the practices of archiving. The aim is to explore the specific mechanisms of archival production today and to understand how archiving matters for practicing architects, how archiving connects to designing. As archives are embedded in the design present, I ask what constitutes an architectural archive today? To what extent does design work depend on the intimacy with the archive now? What kind of tools, technologies, and crafts are needed in archiving? As an anthropologist, I focus on the present, and I advocate a type of architectural anthropology that pays attention to the production of architectural knowledge in all its forms, and it's in mundane and practical materiality. I treat archives not as sites of knowledge retrieval, but as sites of knowledge production. And I rely on interviews and ethnographic observation of the practices of archivists, catalogers and conservators, architects and curators to trace the everyday rhythm of archiving as a way to access the specificity of the current conditions of architecture making. My ambition is that this study can bring a new awareness for architectural scholars of how archives are made. After all, research in archives is where historical science is marked with epistemological credentials. For practicing architects, it can signal a fresh way to grapple with the production of architecture. Organizing a working archive in a firm is not an innocent matter. It reflects the creative culture of the firm. This study can also contribute to initiating new conversations between archivists and architectural scholars. In 2014, I began a study of the CCA, the Canadian Centre of Architecture, which we all know. But it's not the visible CCA that I was interested in. With the building we know, the exhibition program and events they host, the study cabinets that you certainly know, but it's the invisible CCA that I wanted to understand and make visible. All these hidden sides of archiving which we rarely witness, like the register office where the objects first arrive in the CCA and get examined, smelled, and then they start traveling in the CCA, the conservation lab where you can see objects like this huge model of Cedric Price, where you can witness the work of conservators, the catalogers' offices where cataloging is done, the workshops where objects are prepared for exhibits, the offices of the curators and conservators, the discussions around objects where objects are being examined, compared, and carefully analyzed, and all these hidden sides in a way. This hidden life of architecture objects, in a way, was intriguing for me to understand, so I started tracing the multiple choices of identifying, characterizing, valuing objects, but also the tiny procedures of measuring, documenting, coding, registering, and taking care of archival objects, and I started tracing also the various trajectories of those objects in the CCA. For today's lecture, I have chosen one example to illustrate this hidden life of architecture objects, and the example comes from one of the most important recent acquisition of the CCA, the Alvaro Cesar's font. As my study started in 2015, I witnessed the big boxes of Cesar's archive arriving in Montreal. after a very long journey from distant Portugal. So these boxes contained materials from 1950s to 2010 projects of CISA in this period. And to understand the process of archiving, I had to visit different cities. I had to visit Porto, the large office at Rua del Lexo, where we can meet architect Álvaro Siza and his collaborators, as well as archivists like Chiara and Magda. In Montreal, we meet Adria and Pamela, who were in charge in archiving the CISA's font and rehousing it. In addition to traveling to those sites and different cities, we also met a number of other actors who made the CISA font possible. Mirko and Martin, directors negotiating the process of acquisition, Phyllis Lambert, the founder of CCA, discussing the split of the archive, Giovanna Borazzi, then chief curator of the CCA, discussing the rationale for CISA joining the CCA, and many other voices. So all these actors also travel back between the two cities. They visit many of the different sites of archiving. They go back and forth, and so I do, together with them for 3 years. That's what I did until 2018. And all these actors are important. They have to be mentioned because archiving does not happen in one particular office, in one particular site of archiving, and is not related to one particular type of expertise. It happens in this distributed network of archiving, but I would like to tell the story of one particular actor today, which is archivist Chiara Porcio, who began working on CISA's archive 30 years ago. Archiving is not a recent activity for the firm of CISA, which began organizing the archive long time ago. In an interview, CISA tells me, I started my practice in '55, and by the 90s, there was a mountain of documents accumulated, and I felt the need to organize them. So you can see his gesture on this picture. A mountain of papers were already in the office. So the archival fever is linked to the messiness of design and the desire to clean the office for new projects. The 1993 Pritzker Prize recognition for his work also led to more commissions, more mountains of paper piled up, and the need for archiving became even more pressing. Trained as an architect, Chiara, sitting next to him, started working with CISA in the 80s on a number of projects, and at the end of the 90s, she became his archivist. In the 1990s, there were a number of influential projects in the office, such as the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Porto, the Chiado, the Torin van CISA, and others, and it became difficult to search for materials in the piles. Chiara was the youngest architect at the time. They will always send her to search for materials on these projects, in these piles, mountains of documents, as CISA pointed out. So Chiara started organizing the archive, introducing some order, introducing an original order in the archive, and that order closely reflected her knowledge of the firm. That's how well organized is the archive now, situated on the ground floor of the practice of CISA, and the practice is still very active. With the years, Chiara gradually developed knowledge of where things stood in the archive, on that shelf or in that drawer. Knowing where is a variation of knowing how. It differs from all the factual knowledge about architectural processes. It is through inserting, inspecting, and memorizing as a repetitive series of operations that Chiara acquired that where knowledge. The minute skill of knowing where is often compared to the grandiose ambition of knowing all about Caesar. His sculptures, paintings, exhibits, writings, and the various collaborations. So Chiara often says, I only know part of Caesar. So after 30 years of working closely with the architect, Caesar, I only know part of Caesar. There's absolutely nobody who could know the overall dimensions of his work, end of quote. Archiving confronts the archivist, as we see, with the partial character of human knowledge and the impossibility of gaining an all-encompassing comprehension of the work of a practice. It also reveals how architecture is part of a broader network of entangled fields, arts and industries, never an isolated bubble. So archiving, we see it here, is not about knowing all, but it is about knowing a little, but knowing it very well, really well. Knowing also where to find more. The life on the second floor of Caesar's practice is overflowing with surprises. So, however, a project only travels downstairs on the ground floor in the kingdom of Chiara when it is stopped, put on hold, or entirely completed. Caesar and Chiara communicate on a daily basis. We see Chiara preparing a drawing for Caesar. He calls her many times during the interview I have with her, and often comes downstairs in the archive to inspect specific drawings. The practice and the archive are always in communication. Have a look at some materials that Caesar had just given her. It is not a selection, it's just a bunch of things that contains a little bit of everything, drawings and different copies that were just on his desk a few moments ago. A message on the front page reads from architect Caesar to Chiara. Chiara now has to go through all these copies and sort them out. When preparing the material for Montreal, Chiara is helped by Magda, another archivist, and they go through thousands and thousands of documents and copies. Thousands of documents. They rarely throw things away. They keep all versions of annotated drawings as they reveal the evolution of the drawing and the design thinking of the architects. So the task of the archivist is not to make selections and evaluate what is the correct or the original version, but to guide people through all these versions. Archivists do not engage in comparing iconic images with replicas, copies and originals, but rather maintain all these differences as having their own merits. The archive does not outline the precious first or last idea, the single creator or the original. Instead, what is foregrounded here is the multiplicity, the variations, the many different repetitions, the many different ideas, the many different voices. Caesar has a very specific and unique way of drawing. With time, he changed his way of doing things. His drawing and handwriting style evolved. His techniques changed. Nothing stayed the same. Because of the constant dialogue with the practice, with time, Chiara also cultivated a very specific skill to recognize Caesar's hand drawing and handwriting in their different variations. This is the advantage of completing an archive alongside an architect who continues to be very active to work and design. Chiara is, for instance, capable of detecting tiny differences in the handwriting of Caesar from the 70s and compare them with his handwriting from the 50s, or his drawing style from the 60s and compare this drawing style with the 80s. And I can continue the list. She can immediately spot if a sketch from a completely different project has landed on the drawings of another building, and so on and so forth. Caesar's collaborators also very often try to mimic his drawing style and the way he produces sketches. And the small differences in the drawings are also very hard to detect. But Chiara gradually learned to distinguish these hardly noticeable variations, for they reveal the hidden collaborative dynamics in the practice. A drawing has so many layers, so many signs that only an archivist can grasp and decipher. Signs are enigmas. They are the object of a temporal apprenticeship, not an abstract knowledge. Becoming an archivist, as we witness here, is grounded in an apprenticeship to the signs of the drawings and the multiple layers and overlapping temporalities of a design process. As Chiara worked on organizing the material, the archive started training her, and that's what she says often, the archive started training me. She started interpreting those signs, translating them. As archivists perform a reading of all those signs, like hieroglyphs, they reconnect events, people, things, sequences, and they indulge in traceability. At the same time, the architects often come downstairs to learn from the archive and re-examine all projects as buildings also age and they need interventions. Both archivists and architects run back and forth in time, interpret and reactivate the signs of design. Archival materials, as we see, are rare epistemic objects that remain connected to the current dynamics of design. Working with series of copies, detecting differences and signs, tracing new connections, the archivists perform a skeletal epistemological structuring of the works of Caesar's firm that will eventually become imprinted in the classification scheme of the archive and will prepare the ground for the work of researchers like you at the CCA. Back to Montreal, the work of archiving continues. The boxes arrive at the CCA and archivists open those boxes and engage in rehousing the material, placing it in asset-free folders and establishing new connections through physical displacement of materials. This afternoon, I follow Adria in the vaults, going through the material of Bonjour Tristesse and completing an Excel file, numbering and describing materials, trying to find new information and connecting this information, then inserting it again in the Excel file. So just like Chiara, Adria is able to extract new knowledge and engage in additional reading of signs. For instance, she finds some new information on the Bonjour Tristesse project, and she adds a note with the newly discovered knowledge for her on the Excel file. The work of archiving continues, and as we see, it generates a configuration of new relations where knowing becomes possible. However, Adrian can stop at any moment and ask, why is this document here? And she takes this question to Chiara first. But if Chiara cannot answer the question, then the question will go to architect Caesar. And a very simple question like this will reveal both Kara's reading of Caesar's work, as well as Caesar's own interpretation of how his work is to be archived, structured, and interpreted. In this chain of interpretations, which involve different temporalities, people, and practices, more knowledge about Caesar's work process is gained. This knowledge gradually leads towards the production of the CCA map of the Caesar font. Once in the CCA, the objects will travel to other sites of archiving, and I'll only mention one other site of archiving here. Let's have a very quick look at the Conservation Lab, one of these sites of archiving. Here we witness archival objects battling uncertainty and the erosion of time, begging for care, negotiating with the environment. These are objects in a state of degradation, in process of fading or aging. Here the discussions revolve around solvents, smells, insects, or the possibility of possible infestation of drawings. On this site of archiving, we see chemical products, controlled temperatures, and different instruments from pipettes to scalpels, spatulas, sponges, and more sophisticated instruments like this microscope, where David, another conservator, is using it to identify the media of a drawing. Here, architecture objects are carefully inspected. They are treated like patients. A medical terminology is very often used here. The objects are described, diagnosed, and the condition report is prepared, like this one. So this is the stage of diagnosis, of scrutinizing the symptoms and detecting flows of the different objects. A simple drawing or sketch, like the one we have seen moments ago in the hands of Caesar, is here in the lab. When examined under the microscope in the conservation lab, this object suddenly multiplies. A closer look at the condition report shows that an object can be decomposed to up to 40 different features: imperfections, tears, scratches, folds, dirt, discoloration, cracks, insect damages, or stains, and I can continue the list. After this careful report is produced, Karen, another conservator, will perform a treatment of the architectural object if needed, if a treatment is needed. This could include oxidation, deinfestation, neutralization of smell, restoration, cleaning, and other treatments. Look at the bodily posture of Karen and all the conservators you have seen in the lab. They're always leaning towards the object, engaging in highly mediated, slow and meticulous process of caretaking, so that the object can talk back to them. All these procedures go in tandem with specific techniques of documenting and inscribing the traces of interventions, which we see in the conservation lab, and lead to the production of more working scripts, protocols, reports, notes, and measurements, all stored in big folders. They all aim at stabilizing the objects, making them more resilient and less dependent on the environment, allowing them to sustain the readability of science. At the end of this process, archival objects are fully prepared to embrace a new life, either to go into an exhibit, to be viewed by researchers and visitors, or to go to the vault to be consulted by researchers. Thus, taking a look at the backstage of an archival institution like the CCA allows us to witness how archivists and conservators learn from the objects by inspecting, identifying, treating, and rehousing archival materials. they manage to acquire a very distinctive microscopic knowledge that comes from the ontological granularity of archival materials. For instance, conservators gain knowledge to recognize objects by the back, simply by looking at different images and photographs. By the back, they gain knowledge about size, media, materials. They can recognize the author. Register technicians identify objects by the smell. Paper archivists acquire the specific knowledge where that Kara was talking about. And digital archivists develop a knowledge forward. They think about the future, of how technology will develop in the future and how we'll be able to read and open a file in 20 years from now. All these specific archival ways of knowing emerge in an intensive, symmetric, and intimate dialogue with the objects as they reveal epistemic qualities they have not manifested before. Thus, I have illustrated in this talk just a few episodes from the hidden life of architectural objects as they travel from an architectural practice to the archive of this architectural practice, and from this archive to an archival institution like the CCA. The architectural archive, we see it here, is not just the reflection of the mind of an architect. It is rather a complex, additive, composite entity that takes inspiration from design as a collective, heterogeneous, and social process. It is a relational aggregate of working materials, all these copies and versions of working drawings, copies of copies that document the thinking process of a practice, plus the many participants in design, plus the many different design dynamics, plus the technologies, plus the skills, plus the social and cultural issues entangled with architecture. So the archive is content and context at the same time. Far from idealizing the archive with a capital A, the archive with capital A as an ultimate source of architectural knowledge or a supreme technology of architectural history, all with capital. What I advocate here is the need to study archiving as a process, to be reflexive about archiving as a process, and to take into account all participants in archiving. So, for instance, while Caesar's name is already engraved in the Golden Books of Architectural History, no one has ever heard of Kara, or Adria, or Pamela, or Karen, or David, or Anne, and I can continue the very long list of archivists and conservators who have spent years and years archiving, processing, and taking care of this archive. Tracing the moves of archiving allows us to witness the usually invisible work of all these actors, both human and non-human, who generally remain silent and outside the limelight of mainstream architectural historiography. Moreover, archiving is never about a specific object, but about architectural material of larger social and epistemic importance for the discipline. The situated practices of sign reading, which we have witnessed, arranging and cataloging, caretaking and preserving, generate larger structuring effects in an archive. Effects that resonate with greater epistemological anxieties in the discipline and the profession. Archiving emphasizes the active and reciprocal nature of tacit architectural knowledge. It is a way of extracting and correcting knowledge that will form the epistemological basis of architectural scholarship. It is a way of crafting history. Thank you.
Thank you, Albena, for a wonderful talk, taking us behind the scenes of the archive. I was asking questions about what we will do with the questions that come to us through the chat, because there's a possibility to also pose questions in the chat if you like, and if there are questions, they will be brought here downstairs to Hamish. Now we are in this setting again, part of the COVID situation. It's a nice setting as such. But now thank you also for illuminating me on why I really like archives, because it's not my habitat, but it's in working life. It definitely is something like a habitat, and it's nice to see also the colleagues at the CCA and how they follow procedures and how carefully they process their work, etc. I cannot resist to share one anecdote, if you don't mind, because for the ones who are not part of the summer school but watching, we are looking at the specific topic of summer schools around Eloud, Giancarlo De Carlo, the Team 10 people, Siam, and my real dip into the archive was with the Alison and Peter Smithson archive, which was a fantastic experience, and it was a place at home. The Smithsons worked from home, and the archive was curated, so to speak, by Alison Smithson, but it always worked indeed with the office space as a kind of parallel but connected world. So there was a little office room where Alison was sitting with all the boxes organized and labeled in colors, so you know what category it was: a finished work, work in progress, a publication. And downstairs there was more. There were drawing tables, assistants were working there. There was a big tank with drawings, working drawings, etc. And I witnessed how it was moved to Harvard, which was a bit sad, but it was necessary to give it another life, so to speak. It's also about extending the life of architectural works, maybe. And it was indeed all. And so Alison's little archival room was like an art piece. And how she was sitting in it and using it for all the publications and reflections, etc. As if you were, Anyway, but that was all torn apart. All the boxes were moved to Harvard, and I also followed the boxes to Harvard, and then, indeed, the photos would go there, the drawings would go there, the text would there. It was like taking a body apart. It sounds a bit desanctified, but that's what it is in a bit. And one of the special things was, and I had to think with one of the slides that there was a note of that something had to go to Chiara. You find these notes in archives too. And there's one special box was there in the Smithson Fund. It was a silver box, the magic box. That's what they called it. And then on some of the notes it was said, file magic box. It was a typical Peter Smithson thing, I think, because it was for the unfinished thoughts and the little scribbles and sketches. So they would even archive unfinished thoughts, or the ones that they recognized as special, etc. So you had somehow a peek in the workings of, the whole, how an architect worked, and as you said, the ecology or the people around it. It's so super that you bring this perspective to us and to the summer school. I was wondering, one question before we go to the, because we prepared questions, and I hope there are some questions from the students here. So please raise your hands and come to the fore. I mean, it's so interesting to hear that indeed knowledge is always partial, and that the whole idea of this universal idea of universal, in a way you are iconoclastic, iconoclastic act in light of what we usually assume as an artist, an architect, a genius, a body of work, as a kind of complete and comprehensive thing. And of course, today we don't think, oh well, I don't, you don't, and many don't. It's relational, it's partial, it's contextual, embedded, situated, etc. Which is not just iconoclastic. I think it also opens up a whole lot of new worlds or meanings. My question is, so you looked at the OMA office and the CISA office. How did you choose those offices? And because do they represent something, or is it? That's the question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. OMA, the reference at the start was just a nostalgic reference, because my very first ethnography of tacit knowledge was in this very city, and actually began precisely 20 years ago. When I first visited Rotterdam to meet architects from OMA. So archiving was not a topic I was quite interested in at the time. I was more interested in how architects get to learn. I was interested more in how they know what they know, precisely tacit knowledge, but from the point of view of cognitive anthropology, I wanted to see them also how they think together, how they learn together, and how they extract knowledge from the kind of network of practice they share in the OMA. And the archiving, the interest in archiving and this new project on archiving involves Eisenman and CISA, because Eisenman's work was the first body of work acquired by the CC International Architect, the first international archive they acquired. Of course, they had a large collection of Canadian architects before, but the first archive they acquired was Eisenman, and then the most recent one, which I was able to follow as an ethnographer at the CCA, was CISA's, and I have seen it with my eyes, how the archive was processed, how it was organized, reordered, rehoused, and how it actually entered the classification scheme of the CCA, and I was also able to travel and interview the practice. So that's the reason why I mentioned these two architects in a way to these two archives in a way to capture the first and the most recent one body of work they acquired of an architect, the archive, the font, what they called font. And the OMA was just a kind of a reference that I wanted to bring, because when I was researching archiving, it was always in connection with designing, just as you said, because the archive tells a lot about the design process, about the organization of work in the practice, about the different attachments of architects sharing the practice. So there's always something that you can capture, something new that you can learn about the spirit of the practice and their culture, their creative culture, by simply looking at the archive of those boxes. And they constantly surprise you. And then when the archive travels and is donated to one institution, very often archives are also split into different parts. They travel all over the world, and they are distributed between institutions, that something is lost indeed, as you were saying. So when I was doing the work on the CCA, I constantly thought about the very first ethnography of architectural knowledge I conducted at the OMA, and how the archive connects to design practice, how archiving and designing connect. And this is the kind of very specific lens of analysis I follow, because archives are not interesting for me just for the sake of analyzing archives and archival practice, but because they tell us a story about design processes, design creativity. Archiving always reveal designing in one or another way, and hence the link to the OMA.
Now, There's one other question, maybe. Can you trust the archive? And you talk to the people there. You talk to OMA. You talk. So it's just a little question mark. I want also to put into your heads. Because you talk to CISA, and I hear you quote Peter Eisman talking to you. Well, we just put it all up in the closet. I tend to say, maybe he's much more interventionist in his archiving work than he is telling. So can we? Is it an important question? But how do we work with an archive as a trustworthy source or a net? No.
Yeah, trusting who is the question here, because CISA or any architect will definitely trust the archives in their practice. Yeah. Because this, in particular, CISA's archive was built for years, so 30 years they have spent constructing the archive, and the archive was pretty much designed in collaboration with the collaborators in the practice. So CISA would trust his archive to the extent that the archive becomes the technical memory of the practice. So if there's something that he has forgotten, he'll go downstairs in the practice and he will ask the archive to help him, or ask Chiara to go and consult the archive. Sometimes even like a simple thing, like a simple detail of a building, like he has designed a very specific door or a very specific detail, and then he remembers, for instance, he tells Chiara, I have designed this in 1978, but I don't have the drawings, and they look pretty much like this, so he will draw it. Chiara will take the sketch and will go with her to identify the specific project in 1978 when this detail was produced. And then this detail will come, a door or ornament or a door handle will come back to the practice. Then the archive will speak back to the practice, and then this door handle will be reproduced and integrated in a new project they're currently working on. So the archive is this aide-memoire of the architect and also the entire architectural practice. It's more than just a partner in the practice. Is a living memory. It's a technical, extended technical memory of the practice that constantly helps them in the current design process.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Questions for Albena?
Maybe I'll start off. Start off with one. I was reflecting on. I thank you, Albena. It was a wonderful talk, and I particularly loved this term knowing where, which seems like an obvious one, but I think it made me start thinking about my own experiences of the archives here in the last few months, because I think, like a lot of us starting PhDs recently, a lot of our archival work has been online, and we've been looking at quite explicit archival indexes that someone's created that supposedly represent the collection, and quite often a lot of it's digitized, and you're kind of going through what's digitized. But then coming here again in the context of the PhD, I was really struck by the way a quick conversation with one of the archivists here saves just such an enormous amount of work, that something that seemed like it wouldn't be a useful folder turns out that they have an intuition or a half memory that there's something interesting there, or they'll point you that a particular file that you think is going to be meaty and interesting is in fact not at all. And there's such a huge amount of knowledge, I think, in that, in the intuition of the archivist, as you say. So I suppose I was interested to know what your ethnography of the CCA suggested about the future of digital archives, and the way that these there seems to be a certain tension between the tacit knowledge of the archivists and the really explicit way that we necessarily have to make catalogues, and that there's this interesting gap between the two, perhaps. And so I guess I'm wondering whether you see any way that the digital could ever capture that kind of intuition, that tacit knowledge. But thank you again for your talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Hamish, for your questions. That's a big question. That's a great question as well. I will start by perhaps telling you about a surprise I had. digital archiving is one of the sites of archiving I looked at, and along with paper archiving and the simple kind of sign reading that I illustrated with Chiara. And I found out that a paper drawing is actually much more resilient than any digital file or any digital born material that we have now, and that is perhaps, I don't know, 15 years old only or 20 years old only. And this material is very fragile in the sense that the technological system that created it has to be preserved very quickly so that we know how we read this material in 20 years time. That's why the knowledge digital archivist possess is a knowledge forward. They always think about what will happen in 20 years from now, so that this technological file, this file system, this technological environment could be there so that we can open the file and read the material. But there's also issues of copyrights, of software licenses, the whole technological environment, and the related legal issues in the related industries to digital preservation. So that's a much larger network. If we start unpacking this network, digital archiving requires a much larger network of collaborations and institutions that have to be there so that we as researchers will be able to read this file and open digital born material in 20 years from now. And if materials, this also tells us a story of how important it is to pay attention at these messy boxes now, because a messy box from Alison and Peter can be preserved as such and can be opened in 20 years, and perhaps we still find wonders. And the box tells us stories with material, but a messy box kept 20 years ago without being arranged will contain floppy disks, which are useless because they will be just a piece of plastic. We'll not be able to open those files and read those materials, and that's why preserving digital material is an important question right now. Of course, the coexistence of the digital and the paper archiving is extremely important, and you are right, Hamish, that we perhaps, when we deal with digital archiving and digital material, perhaps we don't have this magic moment or this wow moments when we discover these interesting materials that smell, that tells us a story about the practice, that still keep the traces from the fingerprints of the architect on the materials and have this magical kind of message to us. But perhaps there is an equivalent of this in the digital world as well, and we are simply not there yet in terms of advancing the technology to be able to properly preserve and understand digital archives.
Yeah, it's one of the key questions for us here in Rotterdam, of course, but for all, also at the CCA. It's interesting. You say that you actually need a bigger institutional infrastructure to deal with this properly. I remember, I'm getting also a bit older, but I remember from the 90s when the digital was introduced, we were promised this super light and versatile world, paperless offices, paperless this. We never thought about these huge data centers, and I don't know what was going to be needed to indeed build this new institutional infrastructure. Yeah, so digital sustainability, I think it's a national project for cultural institutions here in Holland. Yeah. And architecture has its special questions there. You have a question, Gennaro Postiglione. The idea is that you stand there.
I use it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and I really appreciate, of course, digging into the archive. I would like to catch on what Dirk said about if we should trust the archive. And I was thinking, I had two experiences in archive digging. One was in a museum, and one was in a living architect. I was very fan Sigurd Leverens. And Fen had an archive not arranged, and I could browse. And maybe I was coming asking about what is this about, and said, no, but this is not important. This you can release, no? So you don't have to take it in. So I wonder if, we don't know now what is, I've never been again to the Museum of Architecture in Oslo, so I don't know if those unwanted or, I don't know, maybe project that he was not really happy with are in the archive at the museum. So there is a wish to build a narrative about yourself as an architect. So what about what is not in the archive? Do we trust that the archive is really representing the truth of the architect, or is a construction, or is a, like Homi Bhabha, nation and narration? So it's a totally imaginary reproduction of yourself through the manipulation of what you deliver. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important question, and of course Dirk started it, but I only answered the part whether an architect could trust the archive that is in his firm, but whether we as researchers or practicing architects and academics, educators, we can trust archives, it's a big question indeed. And I wouldn't say that we should not trust them, but we should be aware of the constructive nature of archives, that there are eliminations and choices, there are things that are not included. There's of course a big debate among curators and archivists whether archives should be curated or not, whether archives are kept as such. There are different classification of archives as well. In the CCA they talk about the messy archive and the well-organized archive. For instance, the CCA, the CISA archive is a well-organized archive, super well-structured, because there was an archivist in the practice who has put order in the archive. But in many other cases, they will receive just a number of boxes. Usually they receive those boxes when an architect has died or a practice has split, and then the CCA acquires those boxes, and this is a messy material, so there's no order whatsoever. And there's a big question, do we put an order in the boxes, in the material, or do we leave them as such? And very often those materials are left as such, precisely for scholars like Dirk, who would like to discover the surprises that the box holds and the hidden messages, the hidden dynamics. There's something about the practice there that we cannot discover in every single box. Of course, depending on the institution where we find archives, and institutions have different mandates. Some foundations, like the foundations I mentioned, which have just the works of particular architects, and we have institutions like the CCA, institutions like the former NI with the national mandate. So we, of course, as researchers have to be aware of the institutional setting we're in, who is behind this archive, who has constructed and in some cases curated this archive, and we will end up, of course, identifying specific lacunas in the archive, or we will find out about the distributed nature of this archive, and as researchers will have to travel from place to place to be able to put all pieces together and construct our own archive in a way. I wouldn't call it mistrust, but awareness of the constructed nature of each archive and the mandate and the specific curatorial intellectual curatorialship behind an archive. In CISA's case, the archive is also distributed between 3 institutions, the Gulbenkian Foundation, the Serralves, and the CCA. So if, as a young researcher, you want to research a number of projects related to Portugal, you go to the Portuguese institutions, Serralves and Gulbenkian. If you're interested in one of the international projects, you travel to the CCA. So it's this trajectory of the researcher of finding out the relevant sources, but also being conscious of the institutional logic behind the archive and the constructed nature of the archive is an awareness, of course, we need to have. Does not mean we are not trusting the archives. We are trusting the different sources differently so as to be able to answer the research question we have in mind, and that's why we are all detectives in a way, as Mark Vigley says. In an archival project, we're all the detectives looking to find different pieces and information, finding out new stories and trajectories, and discovering things.
But it also, it's a meta discussion maybe, but indeed history is constructed or crafted, as you say, and it's not just the archive, but also you as a researcher, you have to make interpretations or fill in gaps or at least map the gaps, etc.
Of course, we never trust just one source. We never trust just one archive. Be it a very prestigious and institution or a small private archive and collection, I would not prioritize the big institutional archive. I will equally look at the private archive and try to crisscross information or perhaps complete the story. These distributed archives will be more and more, I would say, the kind of the way the future will work. Future.
No, that's the network of archives is indeed one of the futures, at least. Maybe there are many futures out there. There's another question by Georg Fragliotis.
Thank you, Albena. It's a fantastic journey, almost a media archaeological journey for the mindset of Caesar. And in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the 90s or late 80s as the beginning of, let's say, the digital wave, but also the beginning of the new consciousness of archiving. But in your talk, you focused more or less on the analog phase of archiving, namely, let's say, sketches. So my question is, could you say something about the impact digital culture had on Caesar's way of archiving or Chiara's mindset of archiving?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm afraid it didn't have a lot of impact. Of course, he acknowledges the importance. This moment in the 80s when computers entered the practice was a crucial moment for the practice. And in the interviews I had with him, he was trying to always put the paper drawing, the focus on the paper sketch, and not that much on the software and the technology they're using in the practice today. So this was also the reason why I kept my interest pretty much on the paper archiving procedures, and also Chiara is also not doing any kind of digital archiving or any kind of archiving of digital born material. So this moment was not very present in my ethnography, I have to say, in the office of Caesar. But I was able to capture it more in the CCA on other projects like the archaeology of the digital, because this was a project that we're working at the moment, the third part, and other projects. But your question is very interesting, because Caesar's practice actually witnessed the two digital turns, the very first digital turn and then the second digital turn. With BIM and all these other softwares, as Mario Carpo is calling it, second digital turn. And yet we have this, we see this focus on the paper sketch. We see this kind of almost, you were talking, Dirk, about iconoclastic kind of attachment to the drawing. The fear to destroy all those drawings, which was also the sketchbooks, which were preciously kept in his house and were not initially considered as part of the archive. Then eventually he was asked to bring all the sketchbooks in the office, and the archivist spent days and days and days going to all the sketchbooks, identifying material that is relevant to some of the projects. So for instance, he was traveling in Brazil when he designed the very first sketches of the architectural school in Porto. And these very first sketches, they're not in the archive, they're in his sketchbooks. But the sketchbooks also contain material from his travels, the faces of his clients he was drawing during meetings, quotes, personal information. So they had to go through all the sketchbooks, literally tear down all the pages that contain unrelevant information for the archive, and then destroy this paper. This was an extremely painful moment for the archivists. It's the first moment they bought a shredding machine in the practice, and they had to shred the paper, and they still remember this traumatizing noise of the shredding machine, because this was an unprecedented...
But who assigned them to destroy that material?
A scissor, because the sketchbooks were supposed to travel to the CCA.
Yeah.
And then when they travel to the CCA, researchers are not interested in personal information. They only look at the pages which contain sketches relevant to projects. Yeah. And this is also very important in terms of tacit knowledge, because researchers could connect different series in an archive. All the projects related to his, like drawings and models related to his projects are in a separate series. Then the sketchbooks, they're in a separate series. Then his lectures, we have his lectures and publications. And if you have to do a transversal move between all those series, there should be some kind of indications that they are connected somehow. And so the archivists had to clean the sketchbooks and prepare them for their travel to Montreal.
And there was never the consideration that a sketchbook as such is an object too.
Yeah.
It's weird.
It's brutal, you know. This is the kind of work that's been done. No, it's often part of the. Yeah, it's a classic story that there are parts indeed for the architect. We're now talking about the architect, but I bet there's employees who also have their own personal stuff from the office at home. So we had an assistant of Bakema, the right hand of Bakema, yesterday in the meetings. It was fantastic to hear his stories about Bakema teaching drawing and in a summer school in Salzburg. So you get this. I mean, he was also like Chiara, you could almost say extension of the architect, but then you have the architect again as the center. But these special persons, these other agents that are also mediators and somehow bring the work forward or transform the work. Those agents are mediators are super interesting when you start to think about the tacit knowledge. What is not the distrust. Well, the distrust. Yeah, you say I put it trust there because you're not allowed to say it. That you distrust the sources somehow. People find it a bit scary if you put people really so. But in history or history writing, it's only real or true until proven wrong, right? There can be new material come up from a box, from an attic, and all sorts of stories go out of the window. So it's fragile, these constructions, and these persons are super important, I think, and they're not just in the offices, but they're also here, I think, in our archive. And so they're like they're like a constellation. It's the boxes and how they're ordered, but then there's these bodies that move in between them and who know much more than are actually in the databases, etc. So we have now projects collecting otherwise, but also querying architecture to try and figure out ways how to bring out those stories too, because there's no metadata label that says gay architect or collectively done or things like that. It's there's the logic that you
it's reading between the lines, crisscrossing, always looking for new sources, and also sources that are perhaps not officially called archives. They might be private collections. They might be a pile of documents kept by practices for different reasons. So we should not be just looking to find this kind of source of knowledge in institutions that
Yeah.
officially label themselves
Yeah.
archival.
Yeah. Paula Stroenden. I think it's a last question. I'm also looking at the audience. Yeah? Okay.
Hey, thank you so much for your amazing lecture. I wanted to ask something regarding the more legal notion of archiving, because I think it's quite anecdotal, but me as a young girl, I was working in my grandfather's architecture office to earn some pocket money, and the only work I was doing is basically archiving letters, and I was always told that this is the most important job because it kind of secures his pension and is there for his the legal or like the liability of the practice. And I think it also depends, of course, from country to country. But in Germany, for example, I think as an architect, you're liable for 30 years for what you build. So the archiving is kind of creates like this kind of security surrounding the practice. So from the very beginning, it is very much part of it. And I was just wondering to what extent like this like legal notion of having to do it in order to be actually able to secure your practice has been playing a role within these bigger firms, and also in to what extent maybe the growing fame and also age of the architects, of course, has maybe changed then the content of what is being archived. And
Excellent questions, thank you. And we have a real archivist among us. That's very important indeed. How long do we keep the archive and for what purpose? I have, of course, in the interviews I have done with practicing architects and also archivists, of course, I have different answers to this question. And as you say, it's very much country specific, related to the legislation in a particular country. So, for instance, Eisenman was telling me he has to keep documents in the office for 10 years related to the Berlin monument, Jewish monument, because if a stone cracks, I'm quoting him, he has to go back to the document, check specifically what has gone wrong and repair. So there's this care, duty of care, which of course is more than this, it's legal obligation. So archives are kept in the practice for a certain number of years, depending on the legal context of the country where the building is, and other, of course, factors, and then they can travel to other institutions and become part of archiving institutions, or become part of this kind of distributed archives that we have been talking about today. And then the other aspect is, again, kind of related to care, which I have seen with Caesar, and perhaps this generation also, your grandfather is perhaps from this kind of generation of architects, is the constant, how can I express this, the lack of linearity. So you're looking at this, how Caesar refers to the archive, time is not linear. We have never been modern. You don't go back to time. Time is always, your time is foldable. The building is constantly yours. As an architect, you have to intervene in this building. And I have seen this with some of Caesar's projects. A project designed in the 60s is now in need of repair, and he has to go and intervene in this building because it's his building. He has to be there, and then he has to intervene according to the spirit of the building, and the archive keeps the spirit. So that this other legal aspect as well. And then interventions, extensions, so anything, any old building that has aged alongside the aging architect is also in need of repair, interventions, and time is constantly folding, and the archive is actually the facilitator of this folding time. So we understand here to what extent it's impossible to think of time as this kind of linear vector, as this kind of step-by-step progression. and how also history is conceptualized through the tools of the archive as something that is constantly in need of rethinking, as something that is crafted, and something that is constantly being reshaped and constructed, rather than something that is in the storage box, is passive, neutral, and we can always go back and refer to it, and it will talk miraculously back to us. No, there's a work, an entire work that has to be put in place, and it involves a lot of actors and institutions so that we can make an archive talk and that we can reactivate this folding time.
Yes. Well, thank you. That's an excellent moment to stop, I think. It's also necessary to stop because of the time. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you, Albena, to take us behind the scenes, and we could talk much longer about this. For the students, there's the opportunity to do that tomorrow with the summer school, and for the audience back at home behind the desk, thank you for joining us, and good night.